and welcome to the program. Canada has recently announced $30 million in support for entrepreneurship of women and vulnerable groups in Ukraine. The Canadian government has also pledged some $50 million annually to Ukraine to support programs for promoting democracy, humanitarian aid, and security and peace. Now, joining us to discuss this and more is Marie-Claude Bibeau. She's Canada's Minister of International Development and La Francophonie. Thank you so much for joining me today. First of all, I just wanted to say that it's amazing that you went to the frontline towns and you've seen the effect that Russia's war has had on Ukraine and the people living there, and your recent announcement to promote women in the economy and business and entrepreneurship. So how can Ukrainian women become more visible in the economy and in the grander kind of business sector in the country?
I think it's like everywhere in the world, we have to be confident and trust ourselves, and we have to trust each other and work together. And I've been visiting, for example, a cooperative in the dairy sector, and women are really, in many cases, leading the family business in the dairy sector, and to see how they can be really empowered economically when they join forces, when they share services, when they share even infrastructure. It really helps to have healthier families and communities that are also more economically healthy.
Right, and what's your impression of how much the government supports different female business owners, entrepreneurs?
Well, I've had some discussions with government representatives as well in different sectors, and I have to say that I was impressed by the level of progress in only 3 years, because 3 years in the life of a country is very short, and making so important reforms in so many sector of activities it takes time, and we have to gain the trust of people and to move ahead, and to see that they include gender component in these reforms is also very encouraging.
Right, and something that I've personally noticed working in Ukraine, and there's quite a bit lacking in the military for a lot of the women, and as well as in politics. I don't know if you're aware, only about less than 12% of women are in parliament these days. They make about less than 12%, which is appalling for a European country, really. A lot of them say that it's due to stereotypes, to old set stereotypes that Ukraine inherited from Soviet times. What are some of the ways to overcome this, in your opinion?
I think we have to work on both sides. The leaders must be very inclusive, must encourage women and ask them to run and to participate. It's really, we have to be inclusive and to go and get these leaders, these women leaders. And on the other side, we all have to trust ourselves, because too often we wonder if we are capable of doing something, and yes, we are. And so it's also obviously the responsibility of women. And I think getting involved in your community is the first step. The first step could be through an NGO, a local women's organization, or whatever, the sector of interest you have, getting involved in a business association. So getting involved in our community is really the first step to get this this leadership and the trust and the confidence, the self-confidence to be able to run. So men have to be inclusive, and women have to be confident and really go forward, because we need to have representation of both women and men around a table, and this is when we make the best decisions.
Right, and going back to the other point, in the military, Ukrainian women have only 2 years ago, they were allowed to serve in combat roles, and this is something that before they volunteered to go to the front line, but again, this was not part of the law. Since that time, despite the new law, not a lot has changed from what I've heard. What would you recommend?
Yes, you're right. The technical assistance we provide in different sectors in the country, including in the military forces, always include a gender component. So we are encouraging the recruitment of women. We are making sure that the men are being trained to respond appropriately to sexual violence, for example. So this is something we do. Yes, there is still a lot to do in the military sector, but I've noticed that in the police, security services, we count a great number of women and young women. And I was impressed because I met with some of them, young women who had the professional experience and decided to become police officer. And I think it's a step in the right direction if you get into the police services and people in the community get used to see women in this type of position of authority. There's a link to be made with the military.
Right, right. Now, Ukraine, another female-related issue here in Ukraine is the Istanbul Convention, which Ukraine has not ratified yet. Well, it's a mechanism which would allow to combat domestic violence and gender-based violence. The Parliament tried to pass it more than a few times. It didn't quite get through. How would you advise that to be quite high on the government's agenda in a future Parliament?
Definitely, and during my stay in Ukraine, I visited a women's shelter. Unfortunately, it's a problem we have everywhere, but I mean, when we talk about domestic violence, to me it's a crime, and it cannot be accepted, and we really have to work on different fronts to end it. And when we are in a crisis situation, when so many men lose their jobs, lose their financial capacity, sometimes they drink too much, and it starts the cycle of violence. So we have to work in different ways also to accompany these families who are going through a difficult moment, because it only increased this problem, and it is not acceptable. And we obviously have to provide services and shelters to the women who are suffering.
Right. And you've visited some of the villages and towns affected by the war in eastern Ukraine. And what was your impression of that? And you spoke to some of the local people there, and
these people are asking for peace. I mean, this is not their war. I didn't feel it at all. They are suffering a lot. I've seen their houses being, having been destroyed or partly destroyed because they are too close to the front line. I've seen these seniors who don't want to leave their house because they have nothing else than this house, this garden, and their too little pension to consider moving away from their house. So I mean, it's always heartbreaking to see this community, and I couldn't see any hate in their discourse. They want peace. They want, and this line is just in the middle of a community. So a woman I talked to was crossing the checkpoint to see her kids, and she was telling me she's doing that all the time because she has kids on both sides of the lines. And other seniors were crossing the line every 2 months because this is they can't leave their home because it is all they have, but they have to come every 2 months to get their pension. So, I mean, I haven't seen anyone who really felt that it was their war. They were just victims of someone else's war.
Right, caught in the crossfire, and families have been separated. There's been so many instances of families separated, and children as well not being able to go to school because of bureaucracy, and sometimes because it's just dangerous and the family can't move.
And the trauma that it causes to be scared and to sleep in the basement because you hear all these fires over your head. I mean, it's not a life.
No, it's certainly not. And the funds that the Canadian government has allocated will hopefully change that as part of the humanitarian assistance.
Well, it will help. We want to help these communities to have a better life, but I mean, we need peace. Ultimately, this is what we need, and then to talk about reconstruction. And not only reconstruction of the houses and the infrastructures, they don't have water because the water infrastructure has been destroyed, and they can't find a deal between the two sides to rebuild it. So we will have to rebuild infrastructures and houses, but we have to rebuild the community and the people, you know, in terms psychologically, but also in terms economically, to find jobs. And yes, the call for proposals we announced, hopefully we want to support projects that will help creating jobs for the people affected by the crisis, and mainly women and girls.
Yeah, and hopefully kind of some of the women who have been displaced by the war and are moving with very, very little funds and who've left everything back at where the combat zone is now, can rebuild their lives and can start over and hopefully start their business, you know, become entrepreneurs.
Yes, or go to school, learn a new career, or yes, this is what we want for them.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
We've been joined by Marie-Claude Bibeau. She is Canada's Minister of International Development and La Francophonie. You're watching UATV.